Yuma, good afternoon. Dan Borscher with ABC News from Ngunnawal Country here in Canberra. Inexcusable and an affront. That's how a new parliamentary report describes Rio Tinto's destruction of the ancient Juukan Gorge rock shelters in May 2020. The report adds the mining giant demonstrated a profound lack of care for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage in this country. The tri-partisan Federal Parliament Committee said the destruction of the more than 46,000-year-old site caused immeasurable cultural and spiritual loss and profound grief to the Puutu, Kunti, Kurrama and Pinikura people, the traditional owners of the site. The Federal Parliamentary Committee has recommended urgent and sweeping changes to federal laws to protect sacred sites across Australia. The committee also lashed the lack of adequate protections for cultural sites of significance and has been investigating the desecration of the 46,000-year-old rock shelters over the last 10 months or so. The ABC's Indigenous Affairs editor Bridget Brennan joins me now. Bridget, an explosive and extensive report. What are the details?
Dan, it sure is extensive. 200 pages of this final report from the Parliamentary Committee, which has really been investigating that terrible disaster that occurred last May on pkkp country, where those ancient rock caves were lost to Australia and that cultural heritage disappeared in a matter of moments. 46,000 years of history gone in that Rio Tinto blast. And so what the committee's been looking at is not just that occurrence, but other sacred sites that are potentially in the firing line, and what's happened to many traditional owners, why they haven't had a voice when it comes to the protection of the sites that are so precious to them. So this inquiry is looking at wide-scale legislative reform at a federal, but also at a state and territory level. And it says state and territory legislation needs to modernise, there needs to be a review of the Native Title Act and new federal cultural heritage protections for all different traditional owners around the country.
In addition, Bridget, there are 8 key recommendations, more than 30 sub-points, also going to the point about applying or really recognising international law as well.
That's right, Dan. It really wants, the committee really wants any future legislation to be underpinned by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it says that that hasn't happened before and that that's been inadequate. And it's really left a lot of traditional owners exposed when it comes to that power imbalance with small traditional owner groups against very large companies, which is obviously what happened in the case of the Juukan Gorge disaster. But it's also looking at issues around native title, prescribed body corporates, which are the organisations set up after a native title determination is made. And it says in a lot of cases, some members of traditional owner groups or different mobs around the country really feel that they don't have a voice and that they're powerless when it comes to decisions that are made. So it's calling for more transparency, different funding arrangements for PBC bodies, an independent fund to be set up there. But one of the interesting recommendations, Dan, is also looking at mapping all of the cultural sites around the country, not just those that are exposed and could be in the line for destruction, but those that we've already lost across the country. So that could be a very large piece of work. And it also speaks about truth-telling, about the impact of the loss of cultural and sacred sites around the nation.
In addition to that, Bridget, the recommendations calling for greater legislation, a new framework that's co-designed to look at the protection of sacred, important cultural sites around the nation. Also, I was fascinated by the sweeping veto power that the recommendations want to create for the Indigenous Affairs Minister, while really centralising power to their office and, I guess, creating a new level of accountability there.
Yeah, that's right, Dan, because if you remember last year when we were hearing about the fallout after Juukan Gorge, we were hearing from the pkkp about all the levels and all of the steps they went to try and urgently stop that blast from happening. And of course, it didn't work and they were left powerless when that happened. And so this is one of the most urgent recommendations, that sense of responsibility really does go to the Minister for Indigenous Australians, which is Ken Wyatt, and away the Aboriginal Protection Act away from the Environment Minister where it has been sitting. And so the committee really says that is a piece of work that must happen immediately, so that the Aboriginal Affairs Minister would have much greater oversight over some of those approvals.
I know this report's only come out in the last couple of hours, Bridget, but have we seen a reaction from the traditional owners, the PKKP people?
Yes, the PKK people have said that they're continuing to work with Rio Tinto in good faith about an improved relationship going forward. But of course, as they've always said, no amount of restitution, money, nice words are ever going to repair the damage that's been done. Rio Tinto, for its part, has also responded saying that it's going to be looking very carefully at this report, and it's also begun, in its words, starting to look through the recommendations of the interim report, which was delivered late last year. It's now reviewed more than 2,500 sites around the country, looking at different sites on their owns across the nation.
And look, Bridget, for Rio Tinto's part, you mentioned there that they're reviewing at this stage. This report, though, has been incredibly scathing about their practices right from the board level down, a lack of cultural awareness, of really caring about the interests of First Nations people.
That's right, Dan, and it really says that the actions were inexcusable and that the PKKP were let down at every single step along the way, including by federal and state ministers. And it was very, very scathing of that in the interim report last year. But what's so interesting about this report is it doesn't just look at Juukan Gorge, it looks at 13 other case studies from across the country, very different case studies, including the Jabberong trees in Victoria, Magazine Hill in Queensland, and it's looking at different scenarios. I mean, this is very, very complex work, very contentious debates around how to protect cultural heritage for all different types of traditional owners across the country. So it's actually looking at very wide-scale legislative reform to ensure we don't see this happen again.
Yeah, comprehensive report. Bridget, appreciate your work on this. We'll look forward to speaking to you throughout the afternoon. Bridget Brennan there, the ABC's Indigenous Affairs editor.